Luck is a skill. That probably seems ridiculous when you first hear it, and to be frank, it is. However, at the end of the day, luck does play a big role in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! As I'm sure you're all aware, players either roll a dice or flip a coin to determine who gets to go first, and that the player who gets to go first in Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually has a massive advantage over the other. But what if I told you that you didn't have to rely on winning a 50-50 in order to get an advantage in your games? I'm Professor Tcg Sam, this is Yugioh 101, and today we'll be covering how you can make the most of going second in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now I bet you're wondering why you should even care about this topic. Like I mentioned earlier, the player that gets to go first is at an advantage. In the modern day game, being able to set up your board before your opponent can usually be enough to win you the game on the spot, given the powerful disruptive nature of many cards nowadays. Even though your opponent wouldn't get to draw an extra card at the start of their turn, they're the first ones to be able to summon their monsters, use their spells, and set their trap cards, all while being relatively unhindered by the opponent most of the time. That's why going second can be a huge disadvantage. If you're unable to break through your opponent's defenses, they'll likely overwhelm you over the next few turns and run away with the game after you've used up all your resources to try to beat them. However, you'll eventually have to go second when you play Yu-Gi-Oh! No matter how lucky you may get. Thankfully, with Yu-Gi-Oh!'s diverse card pool, there are many cards that can help you when going second and ultimately turn things in your favor. Let's take a look at some of them. At the time of recording this video, there are three primary ways you can go second. The first way is to play hand traps. These cards are exactly what they sound like. They're essentially trap cards that can be played from your hand, giving you the opportunity to interact with your opponent when they go first, before you even get a turn. These hand trap cards have disruptive effects that aim to prevent your opponent from making a board that's too powerful for you to break through. An example of a hand trap would be Infinite Impermanence or Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. The next category of cards that help you go second are board breakers. Once again, these cards function exactly as you'd expect. They help you break through boards your opponent establishes. These are usually incredibly high impact cards with the potential to swing card advantage very positively in your favor if they successfully resolve. However, even a card that trades 1-for-1 with an opponent could be considered a board breaker, albeit likely lower impact than some of the other board breakers out there. Instead of trying to prevent your opponent from making a board with hand traps, board breakers allow your opponent to establish a board, then try to break through them. An example of a board breaker would be a card like Raigeki or Evenly Matched. The next way of going second may be surprising to you, but it would be to play no hand traps or board breakers at all, and instead rely on the cards that you're already playing within your deck to help you win when going second. These cards would be already part of your engine and are cards that usually serve other purposes within your deck. For example, Tearlaman's Havness is a key component of the Tearlaman strategy since it helps them fusion summon, but also acts as a hand trap since it can interact with your opponent on their first turn. Similarly, Runic Flashing Fire can not only special summon your extra deck Runic monsters, but also get rid of an opponent's special summon monster, fulfilling the role as a board breaker. Next, I'll go over some of the advantages and disadvantages each of these ways has of going second. Let's start with the hand traps. The biggest advantage that these have are that they allow you to interact with your opponent without you even having to be able to have taken a turn. They essentially function as trap cards that can be used at any time without your opponent being able to know if you had them or not since they reside in your hand. There are also enough hand traps in the card pool to be able to cover a wide variety of situations and also be incredibly powerful against certain decks. Some of the disadvantages of hand traps, however, would be their potential lack of impact later on in the game. If you see hand traps in your hand once your opponent has already established their board, then they usually won't have much impact. Certain hand traps also won't have as much effect against certain matchups as the other ones would, and can lead you to seeing more dead cards in your hand more often. It's also entirely possible that your opponent could simply play through your hand traps and still end on a formidable end board if you don't time them correctly, or they aren't impactful enough in that matchup. So overall, with hand traps, you have to take the risk of either seeing them too late in the game or having them not be impactful enough. However, when you see them at the right time, these can definitely swing the game in your favor and make it so your opponent won't be able to build a board and allow you to push through it when you're on your following turn. Next, we're going to talk about board breakers. The biggest advantage of board breakers is that they usually trade very positively in terms of card advantage and can have very high impact in the game. Since these can be such high impact cards, you may not just need to see as many of them in order to break through a board. Think about something like Raigeki being used to destroy your opponent's entire board of 5 monsters. Another benefit of board breakers is that even if you draw them as your 6th card or potentially later on in the game, they can most likely still be used and still give you value. Now, the biggest disadvantage of board breakers, however, is that you're allowing your opponent to set up their board. It's entirely possible that your opponent's board may be too strong for even board breakers to break through, and you could just end up losing the game since they were able to do their combo uninterrupted. In the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of end boards also have some form of negation effect, which means that sometimes your single board breaker may just end up being negated and ultimately have no effect. So with board breakers, you'll have to think about whether it's worth the risk of not having them go through or your opponent's board being too strong to break through when putting them into your deck. Now finally, the biggest advantage of not playing board breakers or hand traps at all would be maximizing the size of your engine and thus the consistency of your deck. If you don't need to play any hand traps or board breakers in your deck, this allows you to play more consistency cards and ultimately means that your combo will be able to go through more often. In-engine board breakers and hand traps are also usually searchable in some way through your regular combo, which means you could have more consistent access to see these cards in your hand. The biggest disadvantage of just relying on your engine to break boards, though, is that sometimes it just won't be enough. Your opponent may have set up a board that's too strong to break through with your engine, or they may have been able to do their combo because they weren't interrupted enough with your in-engine hand traps like Happiness, causing them to be too far ahead for you to catch up. Usually not playing any board breakers or hand traps, however, is a last resort, or it's very specific to a certain format. And it's usually used when your engine may be too big to fit these cards in consistently. As a result, you have to consider whether or not your engine is usually able to play through the end boards of the most common meta decks out there, then build your deck accordingly based on that. So now you might be wondering, what are the right amounts of these cards to actually put in your deck? In general, it's going to depend on what deck you're playing, but also the state of the format and what other decks are in the metagame. So for example, in a metagame where going first leads to some very incredibly powerful boards that can't be broken through, it's probably better to play a higher count of hand traps in your deck, whereas for a format where your opponent's first turn board isn't really unbreakable but they can play through hand traps very well, then you may want to play a higher count of board breakers in your deck. On this slide, you'll see a picture of how to actually use a Yu-Gi-Oh probability calculator, which essentially helps you calculate what the probability of seeing these cards are in your deck, so you're able to see how much of a certain card that you need to play to get your desired probability. It's pretty straightforward and intuitive to use, but can be very helpful when deck building. I put the link to the calculator in the description below for you to use. Just remember, at the end of the day, there's an element of chance in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, but by using this calculator to improve your deck building skills, you're going to be able to maximize your odds of being able to win through using math. Now, I hope that you were able to find today's lecture in Yu-Gi-Oh 101 useful. Now that you're armed with the knowledge of the 3 ways you can go second, hopefully you'll be able to build your decks with that in consideration and choose the method that is best for your deck. If there are any other topics that you want me to cover, do leave that in the comment section below. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.